Planet Reddit. Today's story is
I sacrificed my family fortune for the love of a nobody. Today we are leaders in tech and my family was scammed by the son of the one they wanted for me. I come from a family with generations of economic abundance, what many know as old money. Throughout my youth, the main objective of my family was to preserve our social position through strategically planned marriages and beneficial business connections. For as long as I can remember, I was constantly reminded of my duty to preserve the family prestige and ensure that our inheritance of economic power and influence would continue. From a very young age, I was made to understand that my main value lay in my ability to create bonds that would benefit the family. The message was always the same: I should marry someone who would not only maintain but also elevate the status of our family. Ironically, my decision to reject their plans turned out to be the wisest I could have made. I had barely turned 20 when my family began to insistently pressure me to get closer to Adam, my brother's wealthy friend. For my parents, Adam represented everything they could wish for in a son-in-law. In his 30s, he had already accumulated a considerable fortune and came from a respectable family. His reputation in the financial world was impeccable, which for my parents symbolized economic stability, wealth, and social recognition. In their mind, this arrangement was perfect. It was like a business merger where I simply represented another asset to increase the family fortune. However, the idea of marrying Adam was completely unappealing to me. Although I never said it openly, everything about him made me feel uncomfortable. The age difference was significant, and the way he treated me was purely commercial, as if I were just another one of his investments. There was no emotional closeness or genuine connection of any kind. He never showed any interest in knowing my aspirations or desires. The conversations always revolved around his successes, his projects, his money. It was clear that for him this was just another business transaction. And my parents saw this union as the perfect marriage. But in the midst of all this family pressure, fate introduced me to Mark. He was different. He didn't come from a wealthy family. He was in the process of developing a business idea that to most people in our social circles sounded like an unrealistic fantasy. Cybersecurity didn't have the glamour or prestige of finance, and my family certainly didn't consider it a profitable industry at the time. But Mark had a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve. He wasn't interested in making a quick buck or gaining social recognition. His focus was on creating something truly meaningful. He had a passion that I had never seen in anyone in our social circle. While others were obsessed with maintaining legacy and status, Mark wanted to build something authentic from scratch. And that authenticity captivated me in an inexplicable way. My relationship with Mark blossomed quickly, although not without obstacles. When my family found out about him, their reaction was one of absolute horror. My parents couldn't understand why I would choose someone like him over Adam, who, according to them, had all the qualities of the ideal husband: established, rich, and from a good family. To them, Mark was a nobody, a man without fortune, without important contacts, and without a place in our world of inherited privilege. But I no longer cared what they thought. For the first time in my life, I was clear about my decision and I was willing to challenge the expectations that had always been imposed on me. The reprisals were swift and severe. By refusing to marry Adam and choosing Mark, my family completely disinherited me. All financial, emotional, and social support was cut off. I was considered a traitor to the blood. Someone who had scorned the legacy they had worked so hard to maintain. I ceased to be their daughter and became a stranger. A person who had rejected a future of wealth and social position guaranteed by what they considered a foolish romantic illusion. Fast forward 10 or 11 years and life has taken turns that none of us could have anticipated. The company that Mark founded has become one of the most important cybersecurity companies in the country. That small business that my family laughed at is now a leader in its industry. Our financial situation far exceeds that of my family at its best, although we have chosen to maintain a relatively low profile, concentrating our efforts on charitable projects and creating opportunities for others. The most ironic thing of all is that part of our company's success is based on preventing exactly the kind of fraud that would eventually lead my family to ruin. All this seemed to be part of a closed chapter in my life, something I had left behind a long time ago. Mark and I built something genuine together, something that my family could never understand because it was not based on the appearances they valued so much. For years, I found peace in this new life. Until, as often happens, recent events brought it all back into my present in an overwhelming way. Remember Adam, the man my family was so keen for me to marry? His son, Ryan, is at the center of this situation. 2 months ago it was discovered that Ryan had been operating a huge Ponzi scheme through a branch of his father's company. He had managed to convince numerous wealthy families, including mine, to invest in what he presented as revolutionary blockchain technology. He promised extraordinary returns, and people, anxious not to miss out on the next big investment opportunity, handed over their money without question. But it all turned out to be an elaborate lie. The technology was not revolutionary at all, and the returns were completely fictitious. The whole operation was a fraud, a structure that collapsed as soon as the regulators began to investigate. Ryan had been running the scam for years, accumulating millions while keeping investors happy with false reports of his supposed profits. When the truth came out, the impact was devastating. Families who had built up their wealth over generations lost everything in a matter of days. And my family, with all their supposed financial expertise and connections, was one of the hardest hit. I found out about the whole situation through old acquaintances who still keep in touch with the world I left behind. The details were shocking. Adam's company was under intense scrutiny. Ryan was facing serious federal charges. My family had been left completely broke. Their wealth, which once seemed inexhaustible, had suddenly vanished. The irony of the situation was almost unbelievable. And just when I was trying to assimilate this information, something even more surprising happened. The day after I found out about Ryan's fraud, my mother got in touch with me after a decade of absolute silence. She approached me as if no time had passed. At first, I found it hard to process the situation. The last time I had heard from her was when she informed me that I was no longer welcome in the family. And now, after 10 years of pretending that I didn't exist, here she was, calling me as if nothing had happened. But, naturally, everything had changed. My mother wasn't reaching out looking for reconciliation or to offer apologies. She did it because they were in a desperate situation. Their property, their savings, their position in society, everything they had worked for during their lives had disappeared. The Ryan scheme had left them with nothing. And now they were turning to Mark and me for help to get out of this crisis. They weren't just asking for financial support, although that would have been daring enough. They wanted us to use Mark's company resources to help them track down and recover their lost funds. They wanted us to use our business contacts to open doors for them, to help them salvage whatever vestige of their old life was possible. The same people who had looked down on Mark as common were now begging for his expertise. The nerve was truly astounding. After my mother's messages, an avalanche of emails, text messages, and voice messages from various family members began. They all shared the same purpose. They needed urgent help. They were desperate. And above all, they hoped that I would intervene to rescue them from the consequences of their own decisions. It was surreal to read their pleas and recognize the same manipulative strategies they had used on me years ago. They spoke of family loyalty as if the last 10 years hadn't passed with them acting as if I didn't exist. However, despite everything, I find myself in an internal dilemma. Part of me experiences a certain perverse satisfaction. There is something of poetic justice in seeing how their arrogance finally collapses around them. They dedicated their lives to the pursuit of wealth and social status, and in the end they lost everything. But another part of me can't help but feel compassion, especially for my younger cousins, who were just children when all this happened. They didn't choose to be born into this family or to adopt this lifestyle, and yet they are suffering the consequences just like everyone else. That's why I'm turning to you, the Reddit community. If you have any advice to offer, I'd be grateful to hear it. Update 1. After telling Mark about my family's sudden cry for help, I anticipated that he would react angrily or at least feel as divided as I did. However, true to his character, this was not the case. Mark has always been a person who contemplates the big picture, someone who believes in doing the right thing regardless of previous personal circumstances. He proposed that, as a minimum, we should meet with my family to understand their needs. He made no commitments in advance, but mentioned that if their requests were sensible and within our means, we could offer them support. He assured me that I would not have to face this situation without his support. I didn't know whether to admire his sense of responsibility or whether it only intensified my bitterness. I didn't feel ready to see them. Part of me wanted to ignore the whole situation and act as if they didn't exist, just as they had done to me for so long. But there was another part of me that was inevitably curious to see them again. What would the encounter be like after so many years? Would they apologize? Would they finally acknowledge the damage they had caused me, the way they had treated me as a disappointment for choosing love over money? With Mark by my side, we agreed to meet my parents in a reserved space, away from prying eyes that might recognize us. On entering the place, I was struck by how little everything had changed. My parents looked exactly the same as the last time I saw them, refined, impeccable and completely indifferent. My mother examined me briefly, almost as if she were conducting a clinical evaluation, while my father looked through me as if I were an insignificant matter he had to attend to. There was no warmth or affection whatsoever. The situation was more like a business meeting than a family reunion after 10 years of estrangement. They greeted Mark with more attention than they gave me, although not in a respectful way. They spoke to him with an air of authority, as if his current financial position gave them the right to demand his time and effort. My father didn't even bother to maintain social formalities, he got straight to the point. They needed Mark's company to help track down and recover their lost funds, and they needed it urgently. I watched in silence as they set out their expectations without showing any gratitude. There was no mention of the past, not a word about the fact that Mark and I owed them nothing. No apology for having cut me off, no acknowledgement of the pain they caused when they decided to turn their backs on me because I no longer fitted into their perfectly ordered world. It was as if the last decade had never happened, as if I had never been disinherited. To them, I was still their daughter, and now that they needed something, they expected me to act accordingly. Mark, ever the professional, remained calm and tried to handle the situation diplomatically. He asked questions, seeking to understand the magnitude of their losses and what they specifically expected from us. He explained that forensic accounting and the tracking of misplaced funds would take time, and that this was not something that could be resolved immediately. However, the more he talked, the more it became clear that they weren't interested in the technical aspects. They just wanted immediate results. They wanted Mark to use his influence to recover their fortune as soon as possible, without considering what was feasible. The nerve was unbelievable. My parents didn't even seem to realize how unreasonable their demands were. They talked as if Mark had an obligation to them, as if it were his duty to solve the problem they had gotten themselves into. At one point, my father even insinuated that Mark's success was somehow linked to the opportunities one had once been given, suggesting that we wouldn't be where we are today without his support back then. I felt anger consuming me. I tried to keep my composure, but the more I listened, the angrier I became. The insolence of the whole thing, his indifference towards me, his complete lack of consideration for the fact that I had been disinherited, and now his demands for help as if nothing had happened, it was too much. And then, when my mother made a casual comment about how family is family and the past was in the past, I exploded. I told them that they were the last people to be giving lessons on the importance of family. They abandoned me. They disinherited me because I didn't marry the man they chose for me, as if I were a piece in their game. They were the ones who spent the last 10 years acting as if I didn't exist. And now, somehow, they had the audacity to show up here acting as if I owed them something. Both fell silent, looking at me with a mixture of astonishment and perplexity, as if they genuinely did not understand why I was so upset. My father, always the unflappable businessman, narrowed his eyes but remained silent. My mother, always the more manipulative of the two, tried to redirect the blame. "We did what we thought was best for you," she said. "You made your decisions and we made ours." I couldn't contain my reaction and told them that they did what was best for them. And when I didn't conform to their plans, they eliminated me from their lives. They treated me as if I were nothing. And now that they had lost everything, they came crawling back, hoping that I would help them. Did they have any idea how that felt? I could feel the weight of years of resentment and pain boiling up inside me, and I couldn't hold it back any longer. I told them everything I had been keeping to myself for so long. How much it hurt to be excluded. How I had spent years wondering if they ever talked about me and if they ever regretted what they did. But looking at them now, I realized they hadn't. They never had. For them, I had been a means to an end. And now that they were desperate, they wanted to use me again. By the time I had finished speaking, I was literally shaking. I told them that neither I nor Mark owed them anything. They were ungrateful, and the fact that they could sit there and make demands without showing a shred of remorse told me everything I needed to know. For the first time since our arrival, they were speechless. My father tried to speak, but couldn't manage to articulate a word. My mother looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. The silence was overwhelming. And in that moment, I understood that they hadn't come to reconnect, to make peace or acknowledge the past. They had come because they were desperate and they saw me as their last hope. They didn't care about the damage they had caused. They just wanted their money back. Mark was there to calm me down. He looked at my parents, calm and composed as always, and said he would have our team look into the situation. But this would take time and we couldn't promise anything beyond that. We would be in touch if there was anything we could do on a professional level, but on a personal level, we were done. We left shortly afterwards, the weight of the confrontation still present in the air. As we walked to the car, I experienced a strange sense of relief. I had said everything I needed to say, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about it. Update 2. After the confrontation with my parents, life returned to a kind of apparent normality, at least on the surface. Mark and I returned to our daily routine and my family faded back into the background. My parents acted as if they had listened to what we had to say, but it was clear that nothing had changed inside them. They showed no real regret or reflection on their actions. Their behavior during our confrontation resembled that of someone enduring a tedious presentation, simply waiting for it to end so they can get what they want. It was like trying to reason with walls. Despite everything, Mark kept his word. He set up a team dedicated to investigating the situation and assessing the chances of recovering some of his lost assets. We hired the best forensic accounting specialists and legal experts to begin unraveling the case. It turned out that Ryan's Ponzi scheme was much more extensive than anyone had initially imagined, involving hundreds of investors, shell companies, and accounts in tax havens. While it wasn't impossible to trace the money, it was a meticulous process, and it was clear that even with the best efforts, not everyone would recover their fortune. The losses were huge and much of the money had been funneled through illegal channels or spent on ostentatious lifestyles. My parents, meanwhile, continued to show no genuine gratitude for the help we were providing. They didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. They were still obsessed with recovering their social position and their previous lives, acting as if all this were just a temporary setback. It was frustrating to see them clinging to the illusion that things would return to normal and that their wealth and status would magically reappear as if nothing had happened. I found it incomprehensible how they could be so blind to the reality of what had happened and the fact that they had contributed to their own downfall by trusting Ryan so blindly. A few days after the meeting, I met up with some of my cousins. These were the youngest members of the family, who had not been involved in the decision-making but were now caught up in the consequences. Their version of events broke my heart. They told me how the situation within the family had deteriorated significantly, how it was now every man for himself. Once money started to run out, the cracks in the family began to show. What was once a united front of old money and social power had disintegrated into internal disputes, accusations, and despair. My cousins described it as a sinking ship where everyone was fighting for a lifeboat, regardless of who they had to push overboard to survive. Some of my uncles had disinherited their own children to protect their assets. Others had fled to evade creditors, and several had already started selling property and family heirlooms to cover their debts. It was a complete disaster. The younger generation were left to fend for themselves, trying to figure out how to build their own lives in the midst of this chaos. Some were furious with their parents for having involved them in this mess, and others were simply terrified and confused. It was clear that the old family structure had completely collapsed and there was no going back to the way things were. Meeting my cousins made me realize how far removed I had been from all this. While Mark and I had built our own lives, they had remained trapped in our family's world, witnessing its implosion from within. I felt compassion for them, especially for those who had had no say in the matter, but were now suffering the consequences of their parents' greed and short-sightedness. I wanted to help them more, but it was difficult even to get close to some of the other family members. Many still saw me as the black sheep, the one who had defied the family's wishes. Some even blamed me for not having saved the family sooner, as if my marriage to Mark and our success were somehow responsible for their downfall. To them, I was an outcast who had cursed the family by choosing my own path. The reality was that it was difficult to relate to most of them. Every time I tried to offer support or simply listen, I was met with hostility or cold indifference. The older generation remained locked in their mentality of pride and privilege, refusing to accept that they had made a catastrophic mistake in trusting Ryan. They didn't want to face reality, they preferred to look for culprits, and I was an easy target for their misdirected anger. My cousins, at least, seemed to understand that I had made the right decisions for myself, but even they were cautious about how the rest of the family perceived me. As for the case itself, Mark's team had made some progress, but progress was slow. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and the investigation had expanded far beyond Ryan. It turned out that there were several other people involved in the scheme, individuals who had knowingly helped Ryan set up the fraudulent accounts and channel the money offshore. Meanwhile, Mark's firm had to tread carefully. We were doing our best to help my family recover their losses, but we also had to maintain our own integrity. We couldn't risk getting too deeply involved in a legal problem that wasn't ours to begin with. Our team worked on the case from a distance, providing specialized forensic accounting services and helping to trace any funds that could be located, but we had made it clear to my family that we would not offer personal financial assistance. It was necessary to set clear boundaries, and that was one of them. Many of you advised us to keep our distance from my family, and you are absolutely right. I would like to thank everyone who has followed this story and offered their support in the comments. Your words have meant a lot to me, especially as I navigate this complicated situation. For now, we will continue to help as much as possible, but we will keep our boundaries firmly in place. I will update again when there is more information to share. See you soon. Update 3. This will probably be my last update on the whole situation, as things have basically come to a conclusion. Mark's company completed its work and managed to trace a considerable portion of the money that Ryan had siphoned off in his Ponzi scheme. Of course, we were aware from the beginning that recovering all of it would be impossible. More than half of the funds had already been spent on Ryan's extravagant lifestyle. He had spent exorbitant amounts on luxury properties, cars, parties, and who knows what else. What we managed to recover was only a fraction of what my family had lost, but at least it was something. After numerous efforts, Mark's team managed to gather enough information to locate some funds hidden in foreign accounts. Once recovered, the remaining assets were distributed among the victims, including my parents. While nowhere near what they had owned before, it was enough for them to rebuild their lives if they managed it wisely. That, of course, remains to be seen. Even in the end, their main concern seemed to be to regain their social standing rather than learn from their mistakes. One unexpected development throughout this process was the transformation in the younger generation of my extended family. Many of my cousins, who had been kept on the sidelines for years, finally stood up and took control. They had suffered equally from their parents' mistakes and made it clear that they were fed up with being treated as minors with no say in financial decisions. In several cases, they completely removed their parents from the decision-making process and took control of the remaining family assets. It was a shift in power that was long overdue. I honestly felt proud of them for stepping up and refusing to perpetuate the cycle of arrogance and greed. I could see that my parents were satisfied with the result, at least insofar as they got something back. But I wasn't looking for their approval, and frankly, I didn't care whether they were satisfied or not. There was no big moment of reconciliation, no sincere apology or acknowledgement of the damage they had caused. It's simply not in their nature. However, although they did not express it openly, a silent resignation could be perceived in their behavior, as if they had finally understood, on some level, the consequences of their decisions. Whether they truly regretted how they had treated me was another matter entirely, and one on which I preferred not to spend too much time thinking. One moment that particularly caught my attention was when my mother unexpectedly asked about my children. It was the first time she had shown any interest in them. In all these years, she had never once asked about her grandchildren. I didn't overlook the fact that her sudden curiosity arose after Mark's company had completed its work, almost as if she were paying attention to me as a sign of gratitude for the help provided. I can't say that her act of concern convinced me. Neither you nor I believe that she really cared. It seemed like an empty gesture, an attempt to smooth things over now that the difficult work was done, but even so, I answered his questions politely, keeping a cordial tone. There was no point in stirring up the past at that point. Throughout this whole experience, many people in the comments have asked about my brother and his role in all this. Well, here's the truth. He's been practically absent. After I refused to marry Adam all those years ago, my brother married the daughter of one of my father's friends, in what was presumably another one of those strategic alliances that my parents liked so much. And you know what? Soon after their marriage, they disappeared. They moved abroad and completely disengaged from the family drama. Ironic, isn't it? The same brother who played such an important role in pressuring me to marry Adam for the sake of the family was not there when it all fell apart. It was a harsh reminder that, at the end of the day, everyone in this family has always put their own interests first. To be honest, there is a certain satisfaction in seeing how the whole situation has come full circle, but there is also an underlying sadness in seeing that things will never really change. My parents may have recovered a fraction of their wealth, but they have learned nothing from their experience. They are still motivated by the same impulses that led to their ruin in the first place: status, power, and money. But I have stopped trying to change them or seek any kind of validation from them. I found peace in the life that Mark and I have built together, and that is enough for me. In the end, we did what we could to help. Mark's team completed their work and we will let the family handle the rest of the consequences. My cousins have taken control where they can, and I think the younger generation has a chance to turn things in a better direction. As for my parents, they have managed to regain some stability, but whether they maintain it or squander it is beyond my control. Thanks again to everyone who has followed this story, offered support, and shared their thoughts in the comments. It has been a long and complex journey, but I am glad it has finally come to an end. For now, I will focus on my own family, my children, and the life that Mark and I have built. Until we meet again.